Hello, happy birthday. It's 40 years since you were born, and it's also 15 years since we went to Eastern Europe. So I've used this as an excuse to cut together the video that we took on our holiday.
Let's go.
So, we agreed to meet in Berlin. You made your way there from Drungen and I made my way there from Amsterdam. We had talked about doing a holiday in Eastern Europe and backpacking for years and years, and we put it off and eventually worlds collided and we managed to do it in 2006. I don't remember that much from Berlin because I was visiting Berlin a lot at the time, but I think we showed you the big tower that's from the U2 video. We went to the Brandenburg Gate. We went to the Holocaust Monument. Memorable would be Checkpoint Charlie, Cold War history, and I think we were on television. I think that was the first time in the Eastern European trip we were interviewed on television. We never saw it, and they chose to interview you, and they asked you why you'd come to Checkpoint Charlie, and you said because Neil said it was cool. Live on German breakfast television. From Berlin, we bought a Eurorail ticket and we boarded a train to Krakow. I think it was a direct train. As we drew away, we were waving at Carolina, who was standing on the platform, and you noticed that she was holding your bag with your passport and ticket in it, and we ran off and got it. You were filming that at the time, but we've since lost some of the footage. But I remember vividly you were filming saying, "Goodbye Berlin, oh that's my rucksack," and you ran off and got it. I remember it as being a steam engine, but I don't think it was. Took the train to Krakow. I watched as your eyes widened as you saw the shitty graffiti, concrete buildings, rusted out cars of Eastern Germany and the start of Poland. It looked pretty much just like the west of Scotland, and I think you were a wee bit shocked. For some reason you were sewing a hole in your shorts, so you were sitting sewing a hole in your shorts. Can't remember why, what you'd ripped them on or whatever. So we arrived in Poland late at night, full of exuberance, travelling. It felt very exotic, all in this big square in Krakow. And we went for a wee dinner. I'm guessing we'd been munching loads on the train. We decided not to splurge and went to this tiny wee taverna. Whether it was recommended in the book or not, who knows. And it was all hamburgers and spaghetti carbonara, and it wasn't particularly exciting. And then there was an extra page that wasn't in the English translations which said Polskie Traditionalski or something like that, and I guessed in my finest Polish that meant traditional Polish dishes, and I chose something from the middle of it, and the waiter said, "Oh, I don't know if you want that," and I thought, well, bring it and bring some chips, and he brought me haggis, the local delicacy. There was some confusion over hostel beds. You had been in a super swanky hostel the night before that was like a new student halls, and then Krakow was like a mattress that was that thin on the floor. And then I remember we had a free breakfast, and I've never seen cornflakes that disintegrated faster when you poured the milk on them in my life. So we went a wander around Krakow, and in the daylight it was a lot less exciting. There was a kind of castle that looked like it needed a lick of paint. At some point we met a wee guy called Adam.
Been nice of you to film me.
Who was English and a PE teacher, if I remember rightly. Unfortunately, the number one tourist attraction to see in Krakow is Auschwitz. We hummed and hawed as to whether we should go for quite a while, and eventually decided you don't get the opportunity that often, and it's important that we kind of go and experience that part of history. And we went on a big 5-hour tour, and it was the quietest and best behaved we were for the entire 5 weeks. After Poland, we were aiming to go to Bratislava, and we went to the Polish train station to try and get a ticket. And I, of course, being Mr. Clipboard, had everything organised, and I knew the timing, and I had got us up at 10 AM just to make sure that we had enough time. 3 hours in the train station. We were big backpacks to try and make sure we were in time to catch the train. The way that Polish train stations worked then, whether they still work like that, I have no idea. You queue up in one queue to find out when your train is, and that queue is about 45 minutes to an hour long, and a wee woman tells you when your train is so that you can go and buy a ticket for that train. I already knew what train we wanted to get on, but that doesn't count. You have to go and get the information queue, where she writes it in a wee bit of scrap paper before you can buy a ticket. So we queued up in that and we got to the front. We said, we'd like to go on the train to Vienna that stops at Bratislava that leaves at 1 o'clock. And she said, oh no, there's no such train. We're like, no, there is. It's the big German trains. It's nice and fast. Here's our ticket. It lets us know the trains. She's like, oh no, not possible. We're like, oh Jesus. So we went down the stairs to this wee internet cafe, and I was determined that I was so annoyed that we weren't staying in Poland. We weren't going to go north to try and go to Warsaw, only to turn back and then come back down. And so we were going south, and we were leaving that day. I got the plan together and I rejoined the information queue, waited another hour, got my piece of paper, and then waited an hour in the ticket queue to go and get my ticket, and I got his tickets. And then we eventually went to the platform. The train at 1 o'clock that was going to Austria, the one that we wanted to go on, but we didn't have information for that train, so we weren't allowed in that train. And then we took 7 trains to spend 3 hours going 40 miles south to a wee town in Slovakia called Žilina. Žilina, midway between Bratislava and Košice, at the junction of the Váh and Kajuška rivers, we rolled into Žilina, and it was this wee ski resort. But this was the middle of July, so it was empty and dead. And we went to the only hotel that was recommended in the big fat Eastern Europe book that we had got. And we went to the desk and asked if they had a room for 3. She told us how much it was in local Slovakian currency, and we worked out that that was like £3 a head for a triple room. That's not bad. And we gave her the money and she gave us the change, and it turned out it was basically £3 for all 3 of us. We went up to the room, so they'd given us the honeymoon suite, but they'd added a wee kid's bed for Adam, who was quite short. It had an ensuite sauna, a heart-shaped jacuzzi with a glass bottom and a rotating red light, and there was a mirror above the double bed that me and you slept on. Now you had maybe had 5 nights in a hostel so far, and I'd had about 3 nights in a hostel so far, and we ran down and said we'll take a second night, and then we went out to explore this wee village, and then we bought beer in Tesco's where you got a return on the bottles, and I remember it cost less than 1 pence for a bottle of beer, so we were basically stoating about drinking these wee Slovakian beers. And then we walked along this big industrial river, because this place just wasn't meant for tourism. And we followed these signs for something that said castle, and we just kept on following them, and it was like a magical mystery tour into the middle of nowhere, and these big communist rivers and bridges and 50 shades of concrete. And we eventually got to this wee castle in the middle of nowhere, which was really just a kind of some sort of country house. It must have been where the local landowner lived. And there was a woman behind this wee desk with postcards, and she looked about 120. She was like something out of a cartoon. And we kind of looked around. It had been a nice day. We just kind of went out for a walk, and she was making it clear that we were to wait a sec. And she pulled this young girl down the stairs, who either late teens, early 20s or something like that. I imagine she'd been sitting studying up the stairs, and the wee granny pulled her down the stairs and says, come down and show off your language skills to these big sweaty boys. She said, oh, you want a tour? We have a museum. And we're like, aye, why not? And they asked for 20 pence, and we gave them £1 or whatever as a tip, and they took us up to this museum. And she said, okay, this is the Museum of Tinkering, and it turns out that that's about putting wire round pots and holding pots together. So presumably folk used to go door to door and offer to tinker your pots, which is why tinkers are called tinkers. So it was basically a museum full of repaired vases, which had been repaired with intricate bits of wire like the ones you get in a posh bottle of wine. And she said, if you're ready to start, I'll start the tour. We said, yeah, no bother. And she went, okay, and spoke in Slovakian for about 4 minutes solid. Then at the end of it said, okay, now we move on to room 2. And we kind of looked interested, nodded our head through about 25 rooms like that, all just filled with vases. Then we kind of politely said thank you very much and went on our way. From Slovakia, the whole thing had been thrown into disarray by the Polish train system. So we wanted to continue south and eventually make it to Romania and Bulgaria. But to get to anywhere in Romania was now really difficult because we were off the intercity routes and we were basically in wee council train country. So we were changing trains and you would literally get off the train and not know which country you were in. So we decided that the easiest way to get to Bucharest was to make 2 stops. One in a Hungarian town called Eger and one in a Romanian town called Timișoara. So leaving Slovakia, as soon as we crossed the border into Hungary, like half a mile into Hungary, and there was a wee Hungarian man came up to us and said, "Where are your tickets?" And we showed him the Eurorail tickets and he said, "Oh no, you need a Hungarian ticket to travel in Hungarian trains." And we're like, "Well, we've not been in Hungary yet." He's like, "Yeah, but the train's in Hungary now, so now you need a Hungarian ticket." He's like, "That ticket was valid half a mile ago. Now it's not valid and the train's not stopped." Away you go. He's like, "Oh, maybe if you gave me a bribe." And we had hidden all our expensive notes away. We were quite clever travellers. So we had the kind of smush in a bum bag or whatever. And we kind of pulled out the smush and said, "Look, we're never going to Slovakia again, so we'll give you all our Slovakian money that we've got left and you can just keep it." His eyes lit up and he thought, "Oh, that sounds like a pretty good deal." But we'd already hidden away all our money that was worth something. So we pulled out all this smush and said, "There you go," and gave him like 2 fists full of shrapnel out of bum bags and stuff. And he kind of ran away with it, his eyes glowing, and he looked at it and came back and said, "Oh, this isn't worth anything." We're like, "Yeah, that's why we gave you it." And he was furious. And he said, "No," and he checked his book and flicked through it and showed me a page of text and it says here that you each need to pay €50. And I'm like, "Aye, we're going to give you €150. Eventually I said, "Well, there we go," and I checked another bag and there was €2 at the bottom of it. And I said, "There's all the euros we have. Chase yourself. There's €2. He ran away. You said to me, "Oh, you shouldn't have given him that €2. That's ridiculous." And we were in the right. And I said, "Oh, you don't know. Like, if he called the police or anything, we were in the right, but we could get totally held up and then it's difficult and there's language barriers." And when I said police, his ears pricked up from the next table and he came over and he gave us our €2 back. That was our experience of Hungary, being half a mile across the border. So we arrived relatively late at night. I think it was already dark in this town called Eger, and it's a kind of wee old medieval town which is only famous for one thing, and it's bull's blood wine. The only thing we managed to get from the guidebook was this phone number for a wee old woman that did B&B. So we walked quite a kind of far away around the city walls, went to this wee old woman's house. She took us up to these rooms in the attic. The rooms clearly hadn't been slept in for a long time, and they had that kind of smell of damp, and she spoke no English until we sat down at the table and she started haggling on the price. And she knew all the words in English when she was up in the price and charging us for this. Or there's another special tax that you have to pay. Absolutely taking us for a ride. But the room had started out at about £1.50 a night, and she was haggling it up to about £1.90 a night. Made that kind of cultural thing of haggling to be polite. And then once she was happy, we gave her the money, and she gave us 2 bottles of this bull's blood wine to seal the deal. We got a room for about £1.50 and 2 bottles of wine, and then went off on our merry way and into the centre where we were starving because we'd been in a train all day. There was some sort of wine festival on, but we decided we needed a good feed. So we went to this Bavarian restaurant in the main square. It was, you know, like a leather bound menu that just had sections and pages, and it was like a dictionary. You fancied so much off the menu because you were famished, and we got a kind of big feed of goulash or something like that, and it cost less than £1. And you said, "I just want everything off this menu and it's this cheap." And we had moleskins and notepads, so I told you could order as much as you want, but you needed to have a shorthand notepad and a pen so that you could pretend you were a food critic. We moved on for another big long train journey to go on to a town called Timișoara, but we weren't really going there for any other reason than stopping off to try and get that big bit of landmass done so that we could get back on the main train lines. So we got off at Timisoara late at night again. There was loads and loads of teenagers like huffing glue, like out of plastic bags. It seemed that everybody was doing it. And we wandered off to this kind of really concrete block hotel. I remember there was a bathtub and we all wanted a bath, but there was no bath plug. So the next day we wandered around to try and see Timisoara. My main memories are we went to this relatively intricate church. It was kind of red sandstone but quite modern with a big spire, and so we had a wee wander around there and then we walked up the main boulevard, which if you go far enough east and far enough south they start to name their streets after dates, and this was the date that Ceausescu had been dragged kicking and screaming off his balcony, and they'd get rid of the communist dictator. We kind of went shopping at a kind of swanky shopping street. We were millionaires. They had devalued the leu, but they still had the old versions of the notes. And then we went to a rooftop restaurant. We had Chateaubriand and everybody was dressed to the nines, and we had shorts and flip-flops on. We then moved on to Brasov, which was totally different. Now the guidebook suggested that you phone this man called Dave or something like that, who picked you up at the train station and then took you to a hostel. Whether he was like owning the hostels or not, we weren't quite sure. His phone number was in the Lonely Planet. I feel like that's not how it works these days. He quizzed us as he drove us to our hostel about what business we worked in, because he was trying to make business connections. He sold car parts or something like that, and it just didn't fit with anything that any of us were doing. So we got into the hotel. I have no memory of it other than the Champions League fixtures were coming out and you were determined that you were getting this Romanian telly working. I think I'd needed a shite all day or something, and you're like, what channel do you think? I'm like, I've no idea. And you're flicking through the channels in this Romanian television, and then you found local Romanian telly, and it was the news. It was in a church in Timisoara and they were filming whatever news story about the renovation of the roof or whatever, and there's these two Scottish guys walking along in the background, and you said to me, wonder what they're filming for, louder than the news. So Brasov was really pretty, and it had Brasov in big letters on the hill, and it was lit up, and we found out that that was because Stalin decided to name a holiday resort in each of the countries after him. He renamed the town Stalin and put Stalin in large letters on the hill, and because they didn't really like him, they decided when they got to call it Brasov again, they would put Brasov on the hill. So day one, we went to the #1 tourist attraction of Brasov, which is Bran Castle in Transylvania, home of Vlad the Impaler, otherwise known as Dracula. Now, the Irish guy that wrote Dracula had never been to Romania and had loosely based his character on this medieval guy from Romania who may or may not have lived in this castle. But that did not stop the tourist industry, which took us on, I believe, maybe about a 2-hour bus journey through these beautiful kind of plains of Transylvania, and we eventually get to a relatively boring country house. We queued for forever. It was roasting. We couldn't drink enough water, and we went round this castle and looked at all these kind of wee hidey holes and tried to work out what Dracula had done there. So then when we got back, we went up the hill to the Brasov sign in a funicular, and that was great fun, and you saw the world from the top of this hill, and it was like this medieval town, and it was wonderful. On our way down from the funicular, I think we maybe took the funicular up and walked down, or we had to walk to the base of the funicular or something. But we found a restaurant that sold bear casserole, and we decided that it was a once in a lifetime opportunity to try bear casserole. What type of bear it was, I've no idea. Was it a tourist trap? Also no idea. It was quite stringy and chuk. Bucharest was special because I had been stoating about to conferences for a few years, and there was 2 girls from Bucharest that I knew, Karina and Anka, and they showed us round. We were in a hotel that had a kind of beautiful traditional wooden balcony. Every car in the street was a Dacia. There was potholes you could hide cars in. The whole place had a kind of very run-down feel to it. We were there not that long ago, and it's improved immensely since, but there was a great excitement when we arrived there, and it was great getting taken round by locals, but Anka and Karina gave us the full deal and took us round. They even got us a driver called Victor who drove this white Dacia, which was as old as automobile technology itself, and we drove out what felt like the middle of nowhere. I think they were getting lost, but we were super excited because we were driving along these big long roads. We hadn't even been in a car in ages other than a taxi, and about every 2 miles Victor, who didn't speak English, would pull over into a lay-by and pull out a hammer and just hit the engine as if he was angry with it to keep it going. And eventually they were trying to take us to some sort of monastery, and I'm sure they got lost, but we ended up at this monastery in the middle of nowhere. So we went into this wee room, and it was a tiny main chamber of the church. Every single space on the inside is covered in these icon paintings. For this one, at one side of it there was this gold coffin, and sitting beside the gold coffin was a man who was about 140, and he had long grey hair, which you don't often see in folk of that age. With the assistance of either Anka or Karina translating, he told us that in this coffin was a saint, and because he was a saint, the body didn't smell, and we were to bend down and there was a skeleton in the coffin, and we were to kiss the skeleton to see that it didn't smell. I have googled this extensively and I cannot find out where we were, who the saint was, or what was happening, and we stood transfixed, trying to be really polite. We're in a church, we don't quite know how their stuff goes. We're doing our absolute utmost best to be well behaved and respectful, and he told us to bend down and kiss the saint. So I bent down and kissed the saint, and then you bent down and kissed the saint. You stood up and said, "Did you really kiss it?" And I said, "Of course I did, Gandalf told us to." And apparently you had just faked it, but I winched a Romanian skeleton from the 1800s. When we came out of the monastery, there was a big life event that we enjoyed together. The local priests were all getting drunk, and Romania and Bulgaria have a stray dog problem, and they were throwing meat for the stray dogs and then trying to shoot at them with a rifle, and we were both dog owners. So we said something along the lines of, "Hey ho, hey you did," and squared up to a group of priests who were all holding rifles in their cassocks, and I remember Pope mitres, but that probably wasn't the case. We puffed out our chests and went full into battle. It was one of the few times in our lives that we've even seen a gun. We squared up to priests who were going to shoot at us because we weren't very happy that they were drunkenly shooting at stray dogs, which is probably the same as farmers shooting at crows. So we shouldn't judge, but we had a standoff and they were shouting at us in Romanian, and I think we eventually stopped speaking in broad Ayrshire, given that we were outgunned somewhat. So from that unique experience, we then went back to Anka's parents' house. Definitely not on the Lonely Planet. There was miles and miles and miles, these wee breeze block buildings, dogs barking everywhere, and we had the most amazing barbecue. Far too much of whatever their local homebrew spirit is. They had musical instruments, so we played them and had basically the best party of the 5 weeks. And then at some point we realised that Victor was unconscious in the corner because everybody was drinking homemade moonshine, and our driver had fallen asleep. And you said to somebody, could one of us drive his car? And they said, "Oh no, you can't do that." I said, "Oh, is he quite precious about it?" And they're like, "No, nobody knows how to start it." Our mum had put on food. Her dad had worn a tartan rug and a handbag as a sporran so that he could be Scottish. I convinced you to eat something. I can't remember what it was. It may have been a tomato or an aubergine salad, but you're convinced it gave you the shits. So in the early hours of the morning, with dogs barking everywhere, we managed to get a taxi back to Bucharest. And then when we woke up in the morning, you told me that it was a good idea if we took the sheets with us, because whatever you'd eaten the night before had given you a major case of explosive diarrhoea. And we decided that we'd leave a tip for the cleaners, but we would bin the sheets. So we left Bucharest on a train to Bulgaria. So we got on this train and it was particularly old. As we got further and further into the kind of no man's land between the south of Romania and the north of Bulgaria, the train was getting slower and slower and slower, and it felt like we were labouring somewhat. Now eventually that theory, because we would spend hours just staring out the window and chatting. Sometimes we were on trains for 9 hours and thought nothing of it, and we were saying, do you think this train's getting slower? And no, it's just going up a hill. Now eventually there was black smoke coming out the front of the train, and we were going at about 3 miles an hour, to the extent I was feeding crisps to a dog out the window of the train for a good 20 minutes, and that dog was still in its hometown. The train would stop and they would bring out like comedy tools, bang the engine in the hope that it would stop billowing smoke, and then eventually they stopped somewhere for a wee while and somebody had the right tool to bang it in the right place and fix it. When we crossed the border guards come on. So we were in a wee carriage ourselves, and I remember it like yesterday because I was shit scared. And these 3 big Bulgarian boys came in with their guns on their waist. They said something in Bulgarian, and I said, "Govorite le anglийски," which as far as I know means, "Do you speak English?" And they took away our passports, and then about 15 minutes later a different Bulgarian come back and he said, "Where are you going?" And we said, "Velika Tarnovo," and he kind of looked at us and he disappeared. Now they've had our passports for about an hour. The third one came back and said, "This train doesn't stop in Velika Tarnovo." And I said, "Yeah, I know it stops now. It basically stops in Paisley instead of Glasgow." And then we were getting picked up by one of my friend's brothers. But I didn't have the Bulgarian to explain that, and they didn't have the English between them to explain that back to us. So eventually they came back as the 3 of them, and they had bits of paper, and they said, "We take train, we go to Velika Tarnovo because train is late." And we thought we were going to go to prison for an imagined crime. But what had been happening was these 3 border guards were going back to their wee tea carriage, and they were saying, "How do we tell them? These boys don't speak Bulgarian. They're getting dumped in the middle of nowhere and they need to go to Velika Tarnovo, and we'll reverse the train back up the track, drop them off at Velika Tarnovo and go back down. Right, you go and tell them." Oh, I don't know how to tell them. And they'd been going back and forth trying to work out if they'd enough English to tell us that. They were actually doing us a favour, but we were new underwear status. So we arrive at Velika Tarnovo late at night, and Ivan is a big Bulgarian man, and he decides to take us out and show us Velika Tarnovo, and he made us eat all sorts of strange local delicacies like chicken hearts and all the rest, but we were fine with it. We just took everything in our stride and thought, we'll have some of that, and then went to a bar, and I sat and drank with him until the early hours, and eventually I realised that there was nobody else in the bar apart from me, and I thought he just went to the toilet. I'd better go back to my hostel. I thought, right, there we go. So I went back to my hostel, and on my way back to the hostel I saw Ivan and the barmaid up a back alley. So the next day we did a walking tour of what has to be one of the finest cities in the world. Velika Tarnovo is built at either side of a valley, so there's houses which have 7 stories on one side and 1 on the other, and it doesn't make any sense, defies the laws of physics. It used to be the capital of Bulgaria, and there's all sorts of history, and there's a big ruined fortress, and again you really felt that you were far from home. From Velika Tarnovo we went to Sofia, having met enough locals to convince us that Bulgarian trains were not the way forward. So we took basically a National Express coach from Velika Tarnovo to Sofia. The bus journey wasn't as good as the train journeys. Trains are exciting. So we arrived in Sofia and we went to the Alexander Nevsky big church. And after we'd seen all the big churches that I remembered and checked into our hostel, it was beautiful weather, and I decided that we should get out and see some nature. And according to the guidebook, there is a ski lift that takes you up the hills, and then you can wander around the mountain top. And we thought we'd go up and then walk back down, and that sounded like a pretty good deal. So we got the hotel to order us a taxi, and this taxi driver put us on the phone to his daughter, which was quite strange, but his daughter spoke English. So eventually I'm talking to this woman on a mobile phone to tell this taxi driver that we are going to the chairlift that's going to take you up. Now he's gone past the bit that I thought on the map we should be going to, and I'm like, what about that one there? And he's like, oh no, not that one, we go to a different one. And he took us miles along this road and then dropped us off, and we paid the money, which is nothing. Taxis are costing nothing over there, so they diddle you because you're not Bulgarian, so you pay £2 instead of £1. We already knew that, we were happy. They dumped us out at what looked like a chairlift, but that chairlift wasn't open yet. And then there was this strange man in a tracksuit wearing a lot of gold jewellery who looked like a caricature of a Russian drug lord. He was about 5 foot square with Peter Stringfellow type balding long hair, and he had at least 2 gold rings on every finger, and he said that he would take us back to the town centre for €50. I thought, there's no way we are paying. It wasn't that we didn't have the money, it was the fact that we weren't getting taken for a ride, literally or metaphorically. It didn't look like he had a gun in his tracky bottoms. So we kind of wandered through the middle of nowhere, navigating purely by feel. We kind of wandered until we saw something that made sense, looked at some bus maps until we recognised a bus that would take us to somewhere that looked more like the centre. We beat the Russian mafia by just being stubborn and going a big long walk. So from Sofia we planned to make our way to Belgrade. Now, public toilets in Bulgaria have this unique thing where you have to buy your sheets of toilet paper before you go in. Maybe Bulgarians have this sixth sense about knowing what they're doing. But you had been struggling from your deli belly, so you rushed away into this toilet and bought as many bits of toilet paper as the woman would let you buy. And you came running back out and you said, Neil, it's just a wee hole in the ground, a place for your feet. So in you rushed, and then you came running back out, you threw what was probably a week's wages at the wee woman that was selling you the bog roll. You said, Neil, quick, run, go. You had bent over, but bent over too far, and there was a perfect circle about 6 feet wide of your projectile diarrhea, with one wee tiny clean hole in the middle. And to this day, one of my life regrets is that I didn't go back for a photo. Now, you would have thought that that was the most adventurous thing that we did that day, but we took what was meant to be a 7-hour train from Sofia to Belgrade, and it started out like every other train journey. This one was much busier. We got on with our big rucksacks, and we had our seat reservations, but there's folk in our seats and they weren't getting out the seats. Now, I wouldn't have been bothered, I wasn't being overly officious saying those are our seats, we need to sit in them, but there was literally nowhere else to sit, and we had big massive rucksacks on and we couldn't stop because there was nowhere on this train where you could stop moving that you weren't in a thoroughfare. So I was kicking up fuss with this train conductor, and these people were not moving from their seats, and the train conductor said, go and find somewhere else to sit. But eventually this guy who was a local said, hey, I speak English. So he found us some seats. I found 2 seats, so we'll just rotate, and then at least there's somebody that's not standing, and the bags can be in there with the 2 seats, and that seemed to make sense. So we kind of spoke away to him, talking about English football. He'd studied at an American university, and he was enjoying showing off his English and talking about Braveheart. And as the train got a little bit quieter, we all ended up in this carriage. So there's maybe 8 seats. There was the 4 of us, our new friend Adam, me, Kenneth, and these 4 guys who were all asleep, just looked like local workies. After a while we crossed the Serbian border. We did all the usual stuff. The officious guys came on with the guns in their belts, and then as soon as we had passed the customs port, these guys that were pretending to be asleep suddenly woke up, pulled out a screwdriver, took the panel off the wall, which was sort of an ashtray, sort of a table, sort of a bin, right? And they pulled out all the bits for a sniper rifle and then put them in their bag and got off at the next stop. And we were absolutely dumbfounded. We didn't know that much about Serbia. We didn't know that much about the Serbian war. We hadn't seen telly in about a month. We weren't quite sure if the Serbian war was still on. And we then talked about it for about an hour. And then eventually our Montenegrin friend disappeared for his change to go off to Montenegro. A few hours into the journey, there was a wee old woman came into our carriage, couldn't speak English but made it clear could we help her with her bags. So I took her hold all off the luggage carriage and then 2 bazookas in boxes with a picture of a bazooka on the side. I had no idea that that's how bazookas arrived. Helped her off the train carrying 2 bazookas and a leather holdall, and she went her merry way with a luggage trolley with 2 bazookas and a suitcase in plain sight. Every time we stopped, different folk would go off with a different combination of guns. We don't know to this day if it's something everybody does, like bringing back fags from France, or whether there was some sort of gun fair on in Bulgaria, whether people were tooling up for a war, that who knows. This 7-hour train journey, once we were 9 hours into it, it was clear that we weren't arriving in Belgrade anytime soon. The train parked up at one point and the conductor and the driver got off and loaded boxes into a flatbed truck. The panels in each of the carriages were disappearing as the train trundled on because people had hidden their guns in them. Our toilet that we had been using eventually disappeared. You just opened the door and it was just the moving train tracks below it. By about 4 or 5 in the morning we trundled into Belgrade. We were absolutely shattered. We'd run out of munchies about an hour into the train journey and we just thought, let's get to some hotel. So we woke up the next day feeling tired and done in. Belgrade's a strange city. We went to a military museum where they celebrated having shot down an American pilot. It's the closest I've ever been to being on enemy turf, and I'm not sure I even understand to this day. Belgrade felt dour. I don't have any amazing memories of it other than real bullet holes in the walls and stuff like that. From Belgrade we had to go home somehow, and the cheapest flight that we could find to go home was from Budapest. So our final destination was Budapest in Hungary. I don't think anybody tried to diddle us on the train as we came into Hungary, but they certainly tried to diddle us in Budapest. Even McDonald's was shortchanging you by this point. Everywhere you went they would shortchange you and argue about the price and haggle about the price. It's a national pastime to try and swindle the tourists, but it's a wonderful, beautiful city. It's like Paris but not as cliched, and you've not seen the monuments before. Huge big bridges, huge cathedrals. But from there we flew with Wizz Air, I think, and if I remember rightly it cost next to nothing. I wish I still had the ticket. And we flew back to Amsterdam, where you stayed in Amsterdam for a few days. So all in all, 5 weeks, Germany, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia and Hungary. If you don't count Hungary twice, 7 countries in 5 weeks, and it was wonderful and a great memory. It was the experience of a lifetime, and let's hope we get a chance to do it in our retirement.